My training is primarily in theater theory and performance. I'm also a practitioner, a member of Actors Equity. I work as something called an intimacy choreographer at the moment, but I have a PhD in theater and performance, and I'm super interested in feminist theory, LGBTQ theory, queer theory, a little bit of trans theory, and embodiment in general. So like how bodies communicate on stage is kind of my jam. And at the moment, I am working on my second book, which is about how we represent teenage girls and girlhood on stage, which I think is super interesting because we talk a decent amount about how we represent women on stage and sometimes about how we represent children, but we don't really talk a lot about teenage girls who are this very interesting, what we would say in my field, liminal, so like between things category. And what I noticed a couple of years ago when I was teaching an American drama course at Purchase College was that there is a kind of weird subgenre of evil teenage girls in American drama that is fascinating to me. So the first one in the kind of chronological order is Mary from The Children's Hour, which is a Lillian Hellman play from 1934, mostly known for representing what could be construed of as a lesbian relationship, although the whole point of the play is that they're arguing that that isn't what it is. But she is a whistleblower, but she's made it up, supposedly, this rumor that her teachers are having a lesbian affair. And she's kind of construed as evil and just manipulative. And she goes along nicely with Abigail Williams, who's from Arthur Miller's The Crucible. So now we're moving to the 50s. And similarly, Abigail is there to make up a story, supposedly, about, well, she's making up the witch part, that's admitted, but she is supposed to be kind of motivated to take down John Proctor, who's set up as this very nice, upstanding man. Of course, he's in his 30s in the play, and Abigail is 17, and they have, quote unquote, had an affair several years ago. So our contemporary understanding of that is a little bit different and kind of motivates Abigail slightly differently than was construed of as at the time, is the idea was that it was kind of, the Crucible is looking at sort of how a rumor about someone that can't be disproven can take over someone's life. And of course, that was also being related to the communist, quote unquote, witch trials at the time, right? The HUAC trials and McCarthyism and all of those things. And all of that, the other issues in these plays are important, but what I kept wanting to return to was, what does it mean that these are the two most famous teenage girls in American theater history? And we see them performed a decent amount, Crucible more than The Children's Hour for sure. But that means that we're not only watching these representations of teenage girls, but we're asking people to step into them. And that's really the difference between theater and other kinds of mediums like film. You're not repeatedly asking someone to step into the film every time you watch it. But every time you watch a theater performance, you are asking a living person who either is a teenager or looks like a teenager to do this again and again and again. And I just found that interesting, and I wanted to know what that's doing. First of all, I started looking into the history of teenagerhood, which is fascinating because it's less than a century old. The idea of a teenager is relatively new culturally, which is fascinating because, really there are two kind of main forces that create it in the United States, and really English-speaking countries in general. The first is the federal regional schooling. So before people were mandated to complete schooling at a higher age, the student, that as we think of it now, generally stayed with the family. So up until regional high schools became a thing, and this happens in really the 20s and 30s, regional high schools become a thing, and suddenly there is a time that they are spending outside of the family before they move into full adulthood. This is also a change that comes with industrialization. We don't need as many people at the farm. They can complete more schooling. This is seen as progress, right? That people can go to school for longer. A lot of them are going to co-ed schools. They're now around, people of other genders.
Right.
Yeah.
And that really solidifies right in the 40s and 50s for the most part.
So we think of the teenager we think of as a creation of the 40s and 50s, for sure.
Right.
So
Right.
what's interesting is this is starting to happen in the 20s. We start hearing the word teenager. And the other thing that happens around this time is that advertising notices that teenage girls can purchase things. And really, what we think of as teenagers, the demographic from the advertising side coalesces around teenage girlhood and the fact that we can sell them makeup. So this is a thing that we now start seeing in the 40s and 50s, targeted ads to teenagers. And that was new. No one had ever thought of them having buying power before, and also having social influence, that like these people are tastemakers. And that's fascinating because that gives teenage girls a kind of social power that belies what's actually happening in the culture, right? Uh, they don't have a lot of power in
Right.
any real political way, right? They are not being taken seriously in a lot of ways, except by advertising. So this is the beginning of that pattern that I started to see, which is one of the things that I find so fascinating about mean girls and mean representations of women in general, is that a lot of times the meanness is power. So that's not inherently negative, right? Power can be good. But the other kind of subversive thing that goes along with that is that, well, if women have power, then they're going to use it against other women, or they're going to use it, to push things in ways that are scary and dangerous. And that's kind of where I noticed this mean girls trope is like, mean girls have the chance to bully anyone. They can bully the bullies, they can bully, they can push for change if they have social capital. So why do we keep representing them as trying to take down like very well-meaning, upstanding people? And that's interesting because it goes into a larger pattern that we see in sociology about what's called indirect aggression, relational aggression, or social aggression. So these are, as you can tell from the terms, kind of thought of as gentler, non-physical aggression. This is what we mean when we say bullying most of the time when we're talking about girls. So all of this together, I think, goes to the point of, when we're representing these groups of people who aren't always represented, what those representations mean. Uh, I don't think it's a direct relationship of like, oh, that's the only kind of girl I can be. But certainly the repetition of that has an effect. But also, it's representing something that is real and does exist. It's just not as prevalent. It's not 100% of the time, right?
Yeah.
Or 95% of the time. It's some of the time. And,
Yeah.
this depends on a lot of other factors, how much of the time this kind of stuff is happening. But, so it's not that it's false. It's recognizing something that really does exist, but then it's bolstering it to this degree that makes it seem like nothing else is happening. And that's where I think the danger comes.
Yeah. Do you think it's really interesting the whole background on that, Bess, I think, because, that time period, 40s, 50s, 60s, as you get into the 70s, that was a really interesting transitional time post World War II into the 70s. Do you think that was something that was um, sort of glorified for girls? Because I wonder what always interests me is, you know, when I look at women in business, there's a big movement now for many of us in the tech industry that have been around a long time to support other women, for women supporting women. And early in my career, I didn't always see that happen because, quite frankly, a lot of women felt, I think, well, there's only one or two places for women, right? Everything, all the other places were men. And so whether it was true or not, I don't think it was, but there was a misperception that, if there was an open slot, there's only one woman who was going to get to that level. Meanwhile, there were a lot more men. And so there was a power play, and a lot of women did compete for that, you know, phantom one slot. And there wasn't a lot of help and support given around amongst the women. And I think that that's shifted. Do you
Mm,
think though that, and again, I came into the industry in the 90s, so we were growing up in that time frame, 60s, 70s, 80s.
mhm.
Do you think that representation could have been sort of glorified in some ways where girls felt that they would have power if they were mean? It was a means to get power, in other words.
I think that it's a really good question. I think that it was less that it was glorified and more that it started to be codified in a way that it never had been before. So, like, when people are advertising, they're not like hey, you should push that girl, like get, that girl's a threat, like get out of the
Right.
way. What they're doing is like, hey, if you use this makeup, you're going to get more attention from boys. And that's going to be the thing that helps you go up in the world. And that girl over there who's not using that, she's not going to get that option. And before this, we actually see, I mean, I think a lot of the movie of To Kill a Mockingbird and Scout, like Scout's a little younger than a teen. She's like a tween, but she's a tomboy.
Yeah.
And there's no glorification of her femininity in any specific way. She's allowed to be whatever she wants to be. And that was true of kids of all, both binary genders for most of childhood. Teenagehood also becomes this moment where people are like, and now you will be, a heterosexual middle class functioning member of society. So you have to start behaving in these specific ways, and you can't do these other things. And so, this also, of course, ties in with the way that LGBTQ representation and rights come about in this era too, which is a lot of masking and trying to fit into a mold so that you can have success socially in most mainstream scenarios.
Yeah.
Um, so I think it's less like, but I think the meanness, I think it does relate to what you're talking about because there is this scarcity model, this idea that there's only so many chances, and you have to figure out a way to increase your odds of having access to this. And some of the way of doing that is figuring out ways to diminish other people's chances for success.
It's interesting that you talk about scarcity model because, um, I had another guest on and we were talking about, just how women learn to compete differently than men learn to compete. And this idea of, men compete all the time every day and they can win or lose and it's fine. They just move on and the next day's the next day to compete because they have all these options for competing, right? They have this wide field for competing in various things where I think women even now, I think feel like their options are more limited. And so in that time, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, it was very limited. The only option to compete was for a man, right? And so, it's
Or a secretary
interesting.
job or something. Yeah.
Yeah, or yeah, be a nurse or be a secretary or, get
Teacher.
married, or a
Yeah.
teacher. Yeah. And so there was much more limited scope.